So a couple of videos ago, I showed you guys a project called the Pocket Pi FE from Galaxy Gaming. I finally had a chance to put mine together, so I wanted to show it to you guys. So I've always had a soft spot for the original Game Boy, but as much as I love it, I always felt like the Game Boy Pocket was just about the perfect size and form factor for a gaming handheld. Then a couple of years ago, I took a Raspberry Pi Zero and put it inside an original Game Boy shell, and I called it the Game Boy Zero. Ever since then, one of the most common questions I get asked about it is, could you do that in a different version of the Game Boy, like the Game Boy Pocket? And that's exactly what the Pocket Pi FE is, a Raspberry Pi Zero-based gaming handheld inside of a Game Boy Pocket shell. This is made by Galaxy Gaming. They have a few different options, so you can do it as a fully do-it-yourself kit, which is what I did, or as a pre-built one that you just have to load up with games, and then a couple of options in between. And I'm actually teaming up with Galaxy Gaming to give away one of these. I'll tell you how to enter that in just a minute. But it's got some nice features for these kinds of builds, like an on-screen battery level monitor, safe shutdown switch so you can just flip it off without worrying about corrupting the SD card, a magnetic removable cartridge that lets you access the SD card, and a nice bright screen. And like I said a couple of videos ago, this is actually the same screen that we'll be using in the next version of the Minty Pi, which should be up for pre-order in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. It's also got a couple of nice optional features like a full-size HDMI port and even wireless charging. I haven't added those to mine yet, but I will be in the future, so keep an eye on my Instagram and I'll be posting about that as I do it. And a couple of notes about mine in particular. This is a regular Game Boy Pocket screen lens on mine, but they're having custom glass ones made just for this that'll line up perfectly with the screen underneath it. And then this little scratch on the screen, that's my fault, it didn't come that way, but I'm gonna be replacing that at some point in the future. I did the fully do-it-yourself kit, meaning you have to populate the PCB with all of the little components by hand, all that good stuff. So if you wanna see how all that goes together, keep watching. First, if you want to enter to win one of these, head over to my Instagram account and there should be a recent post about it, as well as a pinned story. The winner will be able to choose between a fully built one or a do-it-yourself kit like I'm doing if you're into doing those kinds of projects. Next, they're still waiting on a couple of parts to arrive from China, but they should be able to send out all of their pre-orders in the next couple of weeks. And there will be more pre-orders for it, so if you missed out, you should be able to get in on the next batch. If you're gonna be getting one of these, or if you already put one together, I've set up a section on the Pseudomod forums just for Galaxy Gaming, so that would be a great place to get support or for showing off your work. All right, let's get started. So I'll start with populating the board, meaning that I'll put all the tiny components and boards onto the main PCB. There's a list of all the parts that you need on Galaxy Gaming's website, as well as a written guide, so be sure and check that out if you're putting one together. And their written guide will tell you which component needs to go where, so I'll mainly focus on the technique of attaching everything to the board. I tried a few different ways of attaching these tiny surface mount components to see which would be easiest for most people. First, I tried using some solder paste. You can get this on Amazon for pretty cheap, and it's basically tiny particles of solder suspended in flux. You just apply it to the pads, position your component, and then heat it up with some hot air. But you may need to hold the component in place while you do it. This worked alright and was pretty easy. Next, I tried putting a bit of solder on both pads and then pressing the component down while I heat up both sides of it. This is something I see a lot of people doing. It works, but it can make it tricky to get it on there nice and straight, so it's not the best way to do it. Here's the power LED. You want to make sure that the little dot is facing down towards the button pads. Being an LED, it'll be more sensitive to heat, so I use solder paste on this one, but I use the soldering iron to heat it up so it wouldn't have prolonged heat applied to it. This little board here is what handles the safe shutdown functionality. For these kinds of boards with holes that go through them, you need to line it up, pick one of the corner holes, heat up the edge of it, and feed a bit of solder into it so it makes contact with the board below. This one here is the battery charger. Don't feed too much through it or you'll make a mess underneath and it can bridge some of the pins, and that's never a good thing. This is the JST connector for the battery. Line it up and connect one of the metal tabs first and then the rest. I actually wound up removing this, and you may not even have one in your kit. I'll explain that in a minute. This board is for the battery monitoring, same process as the other board. Now before you attach the Pi, I'd recommend using a multimeter and checking continuity between the pins on the different board and the Pi, especially this board that'll sit underneath it. Check Galaxy Gaming's written guide for which pins go where. These are the header pins that the Pi will attach to. First we'll attach these to the board, put some solder on one of the corners, keep it heated up, and very carefully line up the pins and remove the iron. Attach the opposite corner and then just go down the line and attach the rest. Make sure that you have a good connection on every one of these because it'll be really hard to find and fix a bad connection after the pie is on here. And this may not be necessary, but I put some Kapton tape over this board since the pie will be right over it, just to make sure that they can't touch each other. When you attach the pie, do one corner, and with that one still heated up, hold the pie flat and straight, and then remove the iron. That'll make sure that it's on there nice and straight. Then do the other pins. Use some flesh cutters to trim down the pins, and that's it. For the micro USB port, what I did was tin the pads, line it up and press it to the board using some helping hands, and apply some heat. Use a multimeter to check continuity and make sure you didn't bridge anything. The pin towards the top of the board is ground, and then the opposite side is 5 volts, and you can check continuity between these two pins and the charger. Volume wheel is pretty straightforward. Be careful not to leave heat on it for too long or you can melt the wheel. The power switch is tiny, but there are legs that fit into holes on the board, so it's easy to line up. Just make sure that you have a good solid connection on each pad so that it doesn't break off. So this is where the sound chip goes, and you might think that this is the hardest part because of how tiny this chip is. I mean, look at this thing. But honestly, it's not bad if you have a hot air rework station. Get some flux, this is the kind that I use, apply it to the pads, and tin them all. Make sure that you don't get too much on the center pad. Clean it off with some alcohol and apply some more flux. Line up the chip. The dot on the chip should be in the bottom left corner. Press it down with some tweezers and hit it with some hot air. That's it. Really not that bad. Look carefully to make sure that you didn't bridge anything, and if you did, it's okay to reheat and remove it and try again. If this part still makes you nervous, so they do sell boards with just that chip attached to it. Clean it up after you're done and we'll add the components around it. So here's what I did for these ones. I applied some solder to one side of each of these sets of pads. Then add each part, and then go back and apply solder to the other side. If you get too much solder on one of them, it's a good idea to go back and clean it up a little bit. And that's it for the sound chip. There's really no way to mess up the headphone jack as long as you make sure it goes on the correct side like this. And attaching the screen is another part that probably looks intimidating, but it's not that bad if you set it up right. So first, add some flux, line the ribbon up about halfway up the pads, make sure it's nice and straight, and tape it down. Then just go down each pin and apply a little bit of solder and sort of sweep it in the same direction as the pins. If you bridge a couple, you can just go over it again with the tip of the soldering iron and clean it up. I went back over it and pressed down on the ribbon cable to make sure it was nice and flat against the board. And then I put a piece of Kapton tape on the back of the screen just to be safe. And at this point, you can pop in an SD card, attach a battery, and test it out. Before doing this, definitely go back and double check everything. You can use the silicone pads to test out the buttons and make sure that they work. So far so good. I haven't attached the speakers yet, but it's these two pinholes here if you want to test out the sound. Alright, now to get the case ready. We'll start with the back half. We're going to cut part of the top to make room for the Raspberry Pi, and then we'll make a dummy cartridge to cover all of that up. Don't worry, I'm not actually gutting Tetris for this. Next, we need to shave off one of these raised bits so that the new headphone jack will fit. And now we'll cut some holes for the L and R buttons. Most people, when they get these, will have button boards similar to this one. This is the one Kite uses with his Circuit Sword boards. And they'll work with some silicone pads like this one. But I got mine before they started including those, so I'll be using a bracket that I made. I took a few measurements off of a similar one by Ampersand on the forums, and it works with these soft tactile switches that pop in here. And you just line it up with these screw holes. It gets sandwiched between the board and the case. To drill the holes in just the right spots, I made this drill guide that you just slide in here, and this is just for my bracket, mind you. The best way to hold things like this in place temporarily is with some hot glue, since you can remove it easily with some isopropyl alcohol when you're done. Use a stepper drill bit like this one to make it about 3/8 of an inch or about 9.5 millimeters. You can do this by hand, but a drill press will make it a lot easier and cleaner, so if you have access to one, definitely take advantage of that. Remove the guide with some alcohol, and there we go. Now for the battery bay, the battery that I got is just a little bit too big for it. I'm not sure if it's the same dimensions as the ones that they'll be sending out soon, but I'm going to remove most of the battery bay to make room for it. And if you do have to do this, just make sure that you keep these two screw holes to hold it together. So for that dummy cartridge that I mentioned to cover up the Pi, you don't need to gut an original Game Boy game if you don't want to. You can get blank carts from places like eBay and AliExpress, or you can get some cool custom ones like this one from Kitsch Bent. We're going to remove the bottom part of the cartridge so that it will fit above the button bracket, as well as this little wall here. Use a file to get it nice and straight. And for the back of the cartridge, use a marker to mark the outline of the case and cut it there. So the cartridge will be held in place by magnets, and the other in a piece that'll go in the cartridge. You can use a dot of super glue to hold them in. Just make sure that you have the poles of the magnets lined up properly so that they'll actually stick together. And then you gotta have a label. This is one that I've had for quite a while. If you want to get a custom label for this, definitely check out Yaya from the forums. He has an online shop set up with a bunch of designs, and even one specifically for the Pocket Pi FE. And there we go. The magnet actually holds it way better than I was expecting it to. I'm not worried about it falling off at all. Okay, so for the front, first we need to snip off these tabs here to make room for the headphone jack. And then we're going to drill holes for the X and Y buttons. There are a couple of holes that go through the X and Y button pads for you to poke something through and mark right where you need to drill. You need to be really careful if you do this by hand though, because if you don't push whatever you're using through perfectly straight, you can end up pretty far off from where you should actually drill. So again, if you have access to a drill press, this is a great way to make sure that you're marking in just the right spot. This piece right here will sit on top of where the screen will sit to help line it up vertically when we put it in there. And then finally we'll add some button wells to the X and Y buttons so that they don't spin around and get stuck. In mine, the top part of the button well actually bumped into this raised part here, so I had to trim a bit of that off, but it still works fine. And that about does it for the case. Now we can put it all together. I wound up trimming a little bit off of the top of this silicone pad, but it still works fine. I used a bit of glue on the speaker to make sure that it doesn't rattle around in there. Now there was a little bit of wiggle room on the screen, so I wound up putting a couple of tiny shims underneath the screen to make sure it sits in there nice and straight. So here I'm attaching the wires for the L and R buttons. The black wire is a ground connection they will share. Now out of the box, these buttons won't actuate these soft tactiles very well, so you need to glue in a couple of tiny discs. But after you do that, they feel great. Alright, so a couple of things. I wound up taking off the JST connector because it was hitting the R button on the back of the case. Those L and R button boards that I mentioned earlier will fix that, I think. The other thing is the power switch. It doesn't directly cut off power from the battery to the Pi. It goes through that tiny green board on the front, which is used for the safe shutdown functionality. And it's controlled through one of the GPIO pins on the Pi. The problem I ran into was that once while I was playing a game, the emulator froze up. But since the Pi was frozen, the power switch was unresponsive. So to protect against that happening again, I'm adding a small switch in line with the battery right here that I can access through the battery door, and then I can completely cut power if I need to. I snipped off the headphone jack pin so the switch would fit. So now if I need, I can stick something in there and totally cut power from the battery if I need to. Also a good idea to put some tape over these buttons so that their pins don't short anything out on the Pi. Now again, this is a stock screen lens for the Game Boy Pocket. They will have nice custom glass ones that will fit the screen in here perfectly. And that's it. Really fun build that you could easily do in a weekend. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Again, be sure to go through their written guide if you'll be putting one of these together. Well, that does it for this one, guys. Be sure and head over to my Instagram account if you want to win one of these. And a big thanks to Galaxy Gaming for doing that and for sending me a kit to put together. Stay tuned for more projects soon, and I'll see you guys next time.